Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 deals with understanding intercultural transitions. And although this chapter PowerPoint is a little shorter than the previous PowerPoints, it is still very important for us to understand the ways in which people make sense of their new environments and how communication patterns tend to assist assimilation processes for people who are joining a new culture, or in the case of many of us, we might be joining a new university or a new job or a new class, or various different types of relocations that people may make in their lifetime, even if they don't actually leave the country with which they were born. So let's get started. Voluntary migrants tend to include people who are sojourners, and these kinds of folks tend to leave their country of origin for a predetermined limited amount of time usually. This would include people like students who are studying abroad. This would also include people who are working in another country for a fixed amount of time, and it would also include people like U.S. diplomats. However, we also have people who are categorized as immigrants, and the main difference between sojourners and immigrants is that immigrants are people who are long-term leaving their home, whereas people who are sojourners tend to be leaving their home for a limited amount of time to go somewhere to work on a certain project, or for a purpose, for school or work, or maybe for political, diplomatic reasons, or things like that. So in terms of immigration, some of the main reasons why people tend to immigrate is for employment, educational opportunities, also for peace or asylum from war or political persecution. Also, people tend to immigrate in order to be with family. And if you think about the stories that many of you have in terms of your own family's immigration to the United States, a lot of people tended to come to the United States or relocate to other countries in different stages. So you might have a few people that go to the country first, and then they set up a situation where they could host other people in the family. And so sometimes immigration tends to happen in stages. And this is one of the reasons why when you talk about immigration issues, one common issue that tends to come up is the idea of keeping families together and allowing family members to stay together. And because of the fact that a lot of times people have to immigrate in stages because it's difficult in terms of economic reasons and getting legal status and things like that, this is one of the things that tends to motivate people to immigrate, is to be closer to family who have already left and who have worked to set up a livable situation so that newer family members can join them in the new country. We also tend to see that migrants who are voluntary may include people who are laborers. So this might include people who are manual laborers or service sector, like people who are involved with, let's say, agricultural work or farm work or things like that. But we also tend to see that some migrant labor is also highly skilled labor. So in this case, you might have people who are like engineers, professors, researchers, things like that. And then they would come to, let's say, the United States in order to work because it provides a good opportunity in terms of jobs and experience. In terms of involuntary migrants, there are many people who end up migrating without a real choice, and these folks tend to fall under the involuntary migrant category. So when we look at involuntary migrants, we can look at people who are more long-term refugees or who go through more permanent relocations, and these are often for reasons related to war, famine, or religious, social, economic persecution. Your book talks about the fact that there have been 1 billion journeys per year in terms of people who have actually left or crossed international borders. So according to Numbers 2008, experts estimate that 25 people cross national borders every second, 1 billion journeys per year. So that's just it's hard for us even to conceptualize or imagine how many people are currently in a process of relocation. I know that the news has been covering a lot of the immigration issues that Europe is dealing with right now because of a lot of folks who are trying to leave other countries that surround Europe. And typically the case is often that immigrants will try to go to countries where there are jobs or stronger economic systems so that they can attempt to start over and create a new life for themselves and their families, which of course makes sense. And many of us would probably do the same thing if we were in situations that were really unpleasant and desperate. So in 2006, in the United States, there were actually 37 million people who had been born in another country. So what we see based on facts like this is that immigration is something that continues to grow. And in fact, immigration is not something that is isolated to the United States of America, but in fact, global immigration patterns are increasing more than ever before. And what you have is you have a lot of issues that, of course, develop around these immigration trends. And we've talked about some of these issues already in the class, and we will certainly continue to talk about them. But essentially, it becomes an issue of how do we manage so many people who are from a different country with different, first of all, you have a legal status, right? So one of the issues that they're dealing with in Europe right now is working to document people who are coming in from other countries that are not a part of the European Union. And they are working to document people as they get into the countries that are a part of the European Union so that there is some way to track or keep records or, basic record keeping, which we have in the United States, right? Everybody has a social security number, and this is the way in which, people and the governments attempt to track people and regulate populations, how many people can come in, how many people can live in certain places, things like that. So they have issues related to documenting people. They also have issues related to language and culture, teaching people the language and culturally assimilating them to the new nation. Of course, those are more long-term issues. In the short term, you have issues related to space, right? So where do these people sleep for the time being while you are getting them documented? What about food issues and medical care and, things like that? So there are very real practical issues related to hosting immigration and immigrants. And every country that is positioned well economically at this point is probably seeing a lot of folks who are trying to immigrate because of the fact that there are some countries in the world that are having such desperate situations taking place in terms of politics, war, famine, economics, things like that. So this is definitely something worth considering, and we're going to continue this on the next slide. In terms of involuntary migrants, we also want to consider short-term refugees that are often considered to be more temporary. So these people tend to immigrate for a limited amount of time. They leave their home or their country or their land of origin. And actually within the United States, we can see that there are several different types of involuntary migration events or trends that we've seen in the past. One of the more recent or more memorable ones might be the Japanese internment camps that took place during World War II. And so many of these people were forced, many Japanese Americans who had actually been in the country for 2-3 generations were forced off their land. They were forced into internment camps because there was a perception that they might be a threat to the United States because of the fact that they were Japanese ethnicity, even though they had actually been citizens or living in the country for many, many years. And in most of these cases, the Japanese folks that were taken away from their lands and communities were able to go back, but a lot of the time when they were interned, their property was also confiscated, homes, valuables, money, so basically it wasn't a very fair migration practice. It certainly wasn't something that I think the United States looks back on and feels proud about. However, that event is something that we can look at as a collective culture and we can say, okay, well, this was something that took place because of a mass fear, right? Like people became afraid that Japanese citizens were going to have allegiance with Japan during World War II. And in fact, they assumed that Japanese citizens would have loyalty to the Japanese flag rather than the US flag, even though for most of these people that were forced into these internment camps, like I said before, they had been in the United States for 2-3 generations or more. And so an event like that really allows us to take a step back and look at the ways in which mass perception guide political decisions. And this is one of the reasons why we talk about issues related to stereotypes, assumptions that we make about certain types of people and what they must be like, right? And this is a historical situation in the history of our country that is a good learning experience for us, right? And in fact, some people feel that there are groups, for example, in more modern times, there are folks like Muslim Americans who, in some cases, feel that they are being unfairly targeted or racially profiled or things like that. And we do know, for example, from the events of September 11th, and we also know that from the Muslim and Christian conflicts that are taking place globally, that these are issues that are concerning to people, and there are certain types of individuals, a minority of individuals, but there are certain people, of course, that are threats, right? And so, it's a tricky situation. There's no easy answer, but generally speaking, we always want to really work to not categorize people into groups based on very limited information. And anytime we start to think that this group of people is like that, or those people all want to do this, start to think it, start to say it, start to assume that that's normal, and perpetuate that kind of speech in our communities or in our families or social groups, right? We need to be very careful of that, because those are the kinds of precursors that can set us up for an internment camp type situation, right? And this is one of the reasons why people who are experts in terms of culture and humanitarian things and all that tend to really suggest and really emphasize the importance of learning our history, because when we learn our history, we can look at the different types of mistakes that we've made and the different types of injustices that have been done to groups of innocent people, right? And by learning these things, we are able to hopefully learn from the past and hopefully prevent these things from happening in the future. We can also look at the U.S. history of forced or involuntary migration in terms of Native Americans that were taken to reservations, right? And in many cases, those were more long-term relocations, so those were not short-term. And of course, we can also look at Native Hawaiians who were also forcibly relocated in many cases to various parts of the islands, right, based on government or economic decision making. And finally, we really cannot forget the forced relocation of many, many Africans to the United States of America during the slavery era. And the fact that this obviously, for many of these people, was, involuntary, right? And so these are different types of involuntary immigration patterns within the United States that we can be aware of. And we can also look sometimes at more of the short-term refugees, even today, that are, let's say, seeking asylum in places like Germany or Hungary, or trying to get to places like Norway, and they're coming in from places like Syria or Africa, right? And these are people who are just basically trying to get away from really terrible situations. And if conditions improved in their country, of course they want to go back, right? Most of us would want to live in the country where we grew up because it's home to us. And so in some cases people get to go back, and in other cases the conditions don't improve and they don't get to. So it's important to be able to distinguish the difference between voluntary migrants and involuntary migrants. There are several different processes that might be unique to people depending on whether they are voluntarily choosing to migrate or whether they feel like it's being forced on them by circumstances beyond their control. You can think about the ways in which a person's attitudes, for instance, towards assimilation, cultural assimilation, might be based on whether they are being forced to migrate or whether they're choosing to migrate, right? Clearly, for most of us, if we were choosing to make a move or choosing to relocate or choosing to move to another country, we probably would have a better attitude towards learning new customs, new languages, and towards adopting those new ways of living into our normal routines, right? There might be more openness to meeting people and to adapting depending on whether we chose to migrate or not. However, if we were forced into a migration situation, we may not feel the same type of openness or receptivity that we otherwise might feel, right? There might be a whole host of other emotional or psychological challenges that people face when they leave countries where they have been dealing with, major war or famine or persecution, and then they finally relocate. Obviously, people that have been dealing with those kinds of situations are going to have a different experience in a new place than people who have left behind something that was more positive, right? So these are all things that influence the immigration experience, and it's very important to be aware of the various types of immigration groups, some of the things that they might be leaving behind, and how those histories can shape the experiences that people have once they actually do get to another country. There are several different migrant-host relationships that we want to be aware of when studying immigration. The first migrant-host relationship is the assimilation perspective. The assimilation perspective assumes that the host country will accept the immigrant group or the people who have immigrated. There is an expectation or a desire that immigrants should have, according to this perspective, to melt with the host culture. And in fact, immigrants who do come to a country with the assimilation expectation will probably experience pressure to assimilate through various types of formal and informal communication means. So one type of pressure to assimilate that we have, for instance, in the United States would be English-only policies, right? And so English-only policies serve a very functional goal in that it's very important for people to be able to communicate effectively in educational or organizational situations. On the other hand, an English-only policy emphasizes that there is one language that is the preferred language. There is one language that is expected. And in fact, a policy that is a blanket policy, such as the kind that we tend to have in the United States for work and educational situations, a blanket policy like that sends a very clear message about whether people are expected to maintain their culture once they get here and how they are expected to maintain it. So generally speaking, if you come from the assimilation migrant-host relationship perspective, it would be fine for people to maintain their original culture, but that would be expected that people would do that in private rather than, doing it more in terms of a public display via language or cultural dress or celebrations or things like that. So that's an interesting perspective. The United States tends to strive towards an assimilation perspective. So the whole melting pot idea where we melt several cultures into one, right? That melting pot ideology, right? Or e pluribus unum, which is out of many become one, right? These are all sort of expectations and philosophies that guide the views that we have towards immigrants coming here. And of course, what this means is if we have an assimilation perspective, then of course, people that do not adapt in a way that is perceived as correct, then of course are, in some cases, they are targets of hostile communication. They might experience various official or non-official punishments. So for example, if you are an immigrant in the United States and you work at an organization that espouses towards English-only policies and you are seen speaking a non-English language at work several times, you will probably hear about it from a supervisor, or this is something that could get written in your file or, some kind of a report or something like that, right? That's more of a formal way that people tend to sanction, lack of assimilation. However, more informal ways are things that we probably have experienced ourselves. So maybe you have, walked by a group of people who are speaking their native language, and maybe they're speaking it a bit loudly, and maybe you hear people in your social group saying comments about, what people should be doing when they get here to the United States. Or maybe people have jokes. Maybe they, target immigrants who don't speak the language with humor, or other types of, sort of informal reprimands, right? So assimilation perspectives are interesting, and it is very important to consider the various types of expectations that come along with these migrant-host relationships, because these expectations shape the way that the country will welcome immigrants. It shapes the way that the country will treat immigrants, what expectations they have for immigrants, and of course, what happens when immigrants violate those expectations. Separation is a different type of migrant-host relationship, and this relationship expects or assumes that people will actually retain their authentic cultural values, in many cases through avoiding the dominant culture, right? Dominant culture. And so actually the separation policy tends to promote practices that are geared more towards segregation. So it's very interesting to think about history and the way in which various points in history have shaped the ways in which we have had migrant-host relationships, for example, in the United States. We can look at, for example, the fact that pre-civil rights era, that the United States actually was a country that tended to promote more of a separation policy between people who were of certain race or backgrounds and people who were in more dominant race backgrounds, okay? So all of these issues are important, they are worth considering, and it's something definitely to be aware of in terms of your own expectations for what immigrants should do once they get to a new country, because your own attitudes about what is considered to be the correct way to assimilate will, of course, influence the way that you view people, right? And the way that you interact with people and the expectations you have. But we can also look at other separation relationships in history. Maybe a non-US example would be useful here. We can look at the history of South Africa, for example, and the apartheid era. And there was definitely a clear separation and segregation taking place between people that were of the Caucasian background and people that were of the African background, right? And we saw that playing out a lot. And there's a lot of visual documentation of that as well. And all you have to do is Google that term, apartheid, and you will see a whole history of the many, many years in which the apartheid era ruled before Nelson Mandela was able to liberate the country eventually. So these types of philosophies are important, and they definitely have implications for the way in which people are treated. Those of us that know a little bit about the apartheid era know that it was not a good era. It's not something that many people who are human rights experts look back on favorably in the history of South Africa. It was a time in which the African people were severely mistreated, and it was something that, again, was another good learning experience for those of us that are studying culture and intercultural communication, so that we can understand the ways in which people have, groups of people specifically, right? Groups of people have made mistakes, have not treated other human beings with the dignity and respect they deserve. And of course, what that means for those of us that are in the modern era taking a class like this is that we can learn from these types of collective events in the past, and we can remember the main principles that we should take away from those ideas, right? So that we don't participate in recreating something similar in our lifetime. And primarily our responsibility, once we know about these kinds of things, is to remain vigilant, right? About the ways in which we are participating in communication, the ways that we are using our time and energy, how we are treating people on a day-to-day basis, right? The kinds of maybe stereotypes or assumptions that we might be taking for granted, or in some cases we might be perpetuating with our social or familial groups without even realizing it, right? And so it's very worth considering these issues as we study the migrant-host relationship. If you are not familiar with the apartheid era, I strongly suggest that you do a little bit of research just so that you can become more familiar about that period in history, so that you can understand a little bit more clearly some of these issues that we're talking about. The third migrant-host relationship that we want to be aware of is that of integration. Integration represents a balance of the assimilation perspective, but also the maintenance perspective. And of course, the maintenance perspective is one where people who immigrate are still expected to maintain their original culture and language, despite the fact that they are participating in the routine communication interactions in the new country, right? So the integration perspective is a balance of merging or assimilating with the new culture and maintaining or preserving the old culture. However, this perspective or this expectation tends to be more based on language and cultural practices. So a good example of the integration perspective would be people that you might know even today living in the States, who, let's say they're from another country, and when they leave their house every day, they go to work, they speak English, right? They go to a dominant American university with the dominant, English as the dominant language and expectation, right? More American cultural values, right? And they participate. However, when they get home, they speak their authentic language. They practice their authentic culture or religious practices. They eat the food that they're used to, right? They engage in more of those routine, authentic cultural practices in the home environment, whereas when they go out in their more public performance of identity, they are demonstrating more of an assimilation perspective, okay? So that would be a good example of the integration perspective. So for example, I know some people, and they are Muslim Americans. They were born in the United States, but they are of Muslim religion, and so their ethnic backgrounds are Pakistani, and so the husband is a doctor, and the wife is a law student. So she's going to be a lawyer soon. And so the wife does wear the authentic cultural wear in terms of covering her head and everything. And however, the husband goes to work and he wears the basic doctor scrubs that a typical doctor in the United States would wear, right? They wear they usually wear like their blue scrubs, their shirt and their blue scrub pants, and then they have like a white lab coat that they put on. So the male doctor, he would go to work, he would wear his typical U.S. doctor outfit, if you will. He would speak English. He would follow all of the protocol for the U.S. medical system. However, when he comes home, he speaks in his authentic language. They practice the traditional Muslim cultural values of praying 5 times a day. They continue to practice their cultural traditions of eating certain types of food and not eating other types of food, right? Specifically foods that are considered to be kosher or blessed, that are blessed before they eat it. That's a very important part of a lot of cultural practices, is the types of food people eat. And of course, what do you spend your time doing when you're not at work, right? And so this couple that I'm talking about, it's very interesting because they fully exhibit an integration perspective, because they are attending mainstream U.S. cultural institutions. The husband is a doctor, the wife is a law student getting ready to pass the bar and become a lawyer, right? However, when they come home, everything is practiced as if they were basically living in their own country, even though they are assimilating when they leave the house every day to go to work or to go to school. So that would be a good example of the integration perspective. And again, this view is much more focused on maintaining authentic language and cultural practices while adopting the mainstream dominant language or cultural norms that people find themselves in after immigration. And we can also look at marginalization. This is a unique situation, and people that are stuck in the marginalization migrant-host relationship tend to probably suffer more than other people because they tend to lack connections with either culture. So if you think about it, when you immigrate, unless you immigrate with family or friends or have a community of people like you to go to, do you really know people in your new country where you can connect with them? Probably not, right? And this is why people tend to choose to live in communities when they do immigrate, where there are lots of other people like them that speak their language or that have their culture. A lot of times it's not because they want to try to isolate from the dominant culture, but they just want to have a sense of belonging to people or to something that's familiar to them, right? Which many of us would probably do the same thing if we had the same choices to make. So folks that are marginalized, they lack a connection with the old motherland because they're not there, and they probably left behind a lot of people, right? And they maybe don't have those familiar people or other people that can fill the shoes of those people in the new country. And they do not connect with the new culture because it's unfamiliar to them. It might be strange or bizarre. Maybe they just don't agree with the way in which that culture is expressing their values or expressing themselves, right? So people who are in the marginalization group are separated from their networks or their cultural origin, but they also lack networks in the new host country. And so, as you might imagine, this can be very difficult for people. And so the people who are in the marginalization culture group tend to probably suffer the most in terms of mental health, psychological health, physical health, because we do know that mental and emotional health are direct contributors to physical health, right? So it's very important to be aware of these different host relationships, because it's my belief that if we can have a little more understanding about the various types of situations that characterize the immigrant experience nowadays, if most people had a little bit more of an understanding about how challenging going through an immigration experience is, it's my belief that many of us would work to be open and friendly and inclusive whenever possible. A lot of times we just might view immigrants as different or strange because they don't look or speak or smell the same as us. They don't eat the same foods, right? And certainly there is a culture difference that we can, appreciate and respect and acknowledge. However, at the end of the day, we are all human beings, right? And I've said this before in these lectures. We may not always have the words to say to somebody. We may not always speak their language, but we can always communicate verbally or non-verbally in ways that convey respect and that we're open and that we're attempting to include people and to be welcoming, right? And so this is something to think about for sure. In terms of our own lives, many of you have probably already gone through experiences where you may have felt like you were an immigrant to a new place. Sometimes we have to relocate for school, or sometimes we have to relocate because our family has to move for work, or our parents had to relocate for jobs, or for various other reasons. Sometimes people have to relocate and move unexpectedly, right? And so the different types of preparations that can go into an immigration or a move may not be there for some people. And so for many of us, I'm sure that we can look back on our lives and we can look through these different types of migrant host relationships that we talked about here. And we can think about, well, okay, I remember a time in my life where I either was forced to immigrate or I chose to go somewhere new, right? Maybe you were forced to move because your parents decided to move you across the country when you were 10, right? That's definitely a type of forced migration. And maybe you didn't have to leave the country. But those of you who have lived in various regions across the United States of America, you know very clearly, as I do, because I have also lived in different regions of the country, that there are very distinct, unique cultural systems that influence the way in which people view the world, communicate, and behave, right? So it's worth thinking about situations in our own lives where we have experienced some of the things, not all the things, but maybe some of the things that some immigrants are experiencing today. And looking at our own lives and thinking about the immigration experiences we have had and thinking back to those challenges that we faced and to some of the people that were able to make it easier for us because they reached out a hand that was friendly, or because they gave us an encouraging word when we needed it, or because they gave us their friendship when we didn't have any friends at all. Those are the kinds of memories and the kinds of situations that can really give us some insight into the ways that we ourselves can help to make someone's life a little bit easier or a little bit better, without doing too much, right? So, and of course, if we were in a similar situation, immigrating to another country, we would hope that we could find people who would also have empathy towards our experience, that would reach out a hand to welcome us, or that would give us some information that we needed to help us out during a time when we needed help, right? So these are definitely things to think about and to be aware of, and to keep in our minds as we continue to go through the course and study the various issues related to intercultural communication. We're going to touch on a couple of more theories here in this PowerPoint before we close. So let's move on to those at this point. According to the social science approach, there are several things that can shape the experiences that people have once they do immigrate or go into a new situation. So we can look at things like individual background characteristics. So things like, how old are you when you immigrate? What gender are you? What is your educational level? What is your socioeconomic class? How much money do you have? How well do you know the language? Do you want to immigrate, or are you being forced to immigrate, right? These are all different types of issues that can shape the immigration experience. But we can also look at the ways in which knowledge or expectations shape immigration as well. And so, for example, one theory that allows us to understand the ways that people make sense of new situations would be the anxiety and uncertainty management theory. And basically, anxiety and uncertainty management theory suggests that all people, when they're faced with new situations, have a desire to try to understand the situation as best as possible. And so if I go into, let's say, a new work situation and I'm at a new organization, I'm probably going to have a little bit of anxiety about a new work situation. I also will probably have some uncertainty about how things take place or what I should be doing and what kinds of issues I need to be aware of that are different than it was at my old job, right? So these are all different types of things that can shape the ways that people approach new situations. So according to anxiety and uncertainty management theory, and by the way, the person who developed this theory was a man by the name of William Goody Kunst, and he's no longer with us, but he worked over in California, I believe University of Long Beach, yeah, anyway. So he studied many of these issues related to immigration, right? And according to his research, he basically suggested that all human beings, when they're faced with situations that are new, have an innate desire to reduce uncertainty or to know what to expect when they find themselves in new situations. So what are the ways that we tend to reduce uncertainty? Well, there's several ways, right? We might ask people questions or watch and see what's going on. And these are ways that we can learn about the way in which things play out, which assist us with predictive uncertainty. So when I have less predictive uncertainty about a situation, I know what to expect, right? I know when things are going to happen during the day. I know what kinds of communication characteristics will mark certain types of dynamics or certain types of interactions. Let's say I'm working in a corporation that works with clientele. It's clear to many of you probably who already work in these kinds of situations that the way that you communicate with clients is different than the way that you communicate with coworkers. And the way that you communicate with coworkers might be different than the way you communicate with your boss. So when we have a good sense of predictive certainty, what that means is that we can understand and we know what to expect in a given situation. However, people also develop what's called explanatory certainty. And this is primarily because they do not want to have explanatory uncertainty, right? So when I have explanatory awareness, what this means is I am able to understand or make sense of why things take place the way that they do. So why is it that people communicate in the way that they do under certain conditions, and why do they communicate differently under other conditions, right? So it's an interesting idea to think about. I'm sure many of us can also relate to this idea of uncertainty management in many of the new situations we've encountered in life. Sometimes these uncertainty management situations may deal with a new work situation or a new school situation. Sometimes it might deal with the group that you've been assigned to work with on an educational project or maybe a work project. Other times you might be dealing with family situations where there's uncertainty. Maybe you have some family members that you don't know very well and that you haven't interacted with much, but that you will be meeting for the first time or that you plan to interact with more. You obviously will go into that feeling some uncertainty. In addition, when you encounter familial systems that are different than your own, whether through friendships or romantic partnerships or things like that, we also go through uncertainty. What can we expect, right? What do we expect to take place in this family system? How do they do things? Is it what we're used to? Is it different? What can I expect when I go into a family dinner, for example? Why do people do what they do? Okay, so these are all principles that all of us can relate to. However, many of the theories that we're talking about in this chapter have been applied to immigration. But as we've talked about, the immigration experience is not only isolated to leaving one country for another. Immigration happens even within the same country, right? And many of us have felt like we were immigrants to a new situation before. And so I think that many of these principles are very applicable to our daily lives as well. According to the social science approach, there are 3 personal attributes that can assist the ways in which people manage uncertainty. One of these things is that people have an established self-concept. So if I have an established self-concept, for example, what that means is that I know who I am, I know what my values are, I have a good sense of what makes me feel good, what makes me not feel good, I understand the kinds of situations that I enjoy and the kinds of situations that provide me maybe with less enjoyment, right? You can use this opportunity to think about what are some of the things that you have assumed or that you have taken on as a part of your self-concept, right? And do you think you have an established self-concept? And if you don't feel like you have an established self-concept, what needs to happen so that you do feel that you know who you are more clearly, right? Most of the time, we develop a sense of self-concept from our family systems, from our communities, from going to college. Like education will teach people a lot about this idea of self-concept, because through the educational process, we learn a lot about other approaches, like other ways of living or other ways of thinking. And when we study other people's ways of living or attitudes, they allow us to make sense of our own attitudes that maybe we hadn't even looked at before, right? So when I look at somebody else who has a different perspective than me, for example, I am able to recognize, first of all, that there's a difference. And secondly, I can recognize, does my perspective align well with that perspective, or is my perspective different, right? So the idea of an established self-concept is something that we want to be aware of, because when we have an established self-concept, we are able to more easily manage situations of uncertainty. Another thing that helps us manage uncertainty is flexibility. So basically, how able are we to be flexible to the demands that we face in a certain situation and to do things in a different way than we're used to in order to go with the flow. For some of us, this might be very easy. For others, this could be a very difficult process. However, it's very worth considering the fact that if we just are able to adopt a little bit more of a flexible approach to dealing with new situations, that kind of approach will probably assist us more than being rigid or fixed or feeling like things have to be going just the right way. Okay? Good to consider. And finally, the ability to see the world or to view the world and the issues in the world through complex categorizations or shades of gray. So what this basically means is that if we are, and this goes back to the flexibility idea, but basically what this means is that if we are able to view different people and different situations and new environments and new cultural systems in terms of a set of complex categorizations, right, rather than whether things are right or wrong or good or bad, okay? When we look at things in terms of shades of gray, we are actually doing the opposite of black and white thinking. And black and white thinking, again, would be something like, well, that's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it, or this way is right and that way is wrong, okay? What I can say about a different way of living than my own, if I have a complex categorization ability, I can say something like, well, okay, that's certainly different than the way that I would approach that issue, or these are different values than what I have grown accustomed to using to guide my behavior, but I understand that culture is something that's learned, and I understand that the values that people have are socialized, and so it's different than the way that I would approach it, but for those people that are doing that behavior, that is very right for them, right? It works for them, it's correct for them, it makes them feel comfortable and good. And so being able to look at different kinds of practices and ways of life in this way with the complex categorization holding on to flexibility, and also at the same time maintaining a good sense of who you are. All of these attributes allow us to encounter situations of difference in a way where we can manage the uncertainty a little bit more effectively, okay? And so for some of us, we have a very established self-concept, but maybe we need to work a little bit more on our flexibility, or maybe we need to reduce our need to try to categorize people into right and wrong groups, right? So you can think about that. You can think about where you fall in terms of these three attributes. And by the way, these three attributes are not only useful in terms of managing different cultural interactions, but also they're useful in managing any kind of situations that are uncertain to you. So you don't have to only think that this is something that relates to cultural communication, but actually you can take this idea of managing uncertainty and the things that will help you manage it more effectively. You can take these guidelines into any kind of new situation, and you can try to weave them into your processing when you're going through these uncertain situations, because behaving and approaching a situation with these three ideas in mind will assist you in being more effective, because you will be able to stay confident and sure of yourself because you know who you are. You can remain flexible to the new situation that you find yourself in without being fixed or rigid. And you are able to stay open psychologically and emotionally to other people and different ways of doing things, because you are not categorizing people into boxes of whether they're right or wrong, or good or bad, or effective or ineffective, or what have you. So these are definitely great things to consider as we continue to navigate the journey of life. Another approach that allows us to understand how people make sense of different situations is the transition model. And the transition model suggests that there are three ways that people tend to communicate or participate when they find themselves in a new situation. The first of these is the fight approach, or participation and jumping in, right? So a good example of this would be, let's say you go to a friend's house for dinner, and your friend is from another country, and let's say her family is eating very authentic cultural food that you're not used to and you've never tried before, but you're open, and assuming that you have a good self-concept and that you're willing to be flexible and look at things in terms of complex categorizations, as we talked about on the previous slide. The fight approach, or the jumping in approach, would probably look like someone who basically, goes to dinner and works to communicate with people as much as they can at the dinner table. This would also look like someone trying all the new dishes that were offered to them, even if they looked a little bit different or a little bit strange. The idea of jumping in and just trying everything that's offered and, doing your best to participate would be probably a good thing to do, because in a lot of cultures, when you do not participate or do not accept food offerings, then you might be seen as rude, right? So the fight approach, or the jumping in approach, is generally a good way to approach new situations. Now, in some situations, you might feel like it's not appropriate to jump in. So for example, if you are in a situation where there's a very fixed protocol for the way in which communication is supposed to take place, or maybe there are certain people who are in positions where they are supposed to be the ones who are primarily communicating or whatever. So maybe you have no clue how things are supposed to take place. And so in this situation, it might be a good idea to hold back a little bit, or to just kind of observe and see, how do people approach dining or eating or celebrating food in this culture, right? You might, of course, rely on your friend who invited you to dinner to give you some guidelines about, what to do and when to do it. But the observation approach is also a very good way to deal with new situations, because you can see how people deal with them. And by adopting the observation approach, that allows you to gain information before you actually do anything. And in that situation, you can hopefully adapt your communication so that you're more appropriate, because you've been watching or observing for a while before you actually jump in and attempt to communicate. Now, in other situations, we may want to use a little bit of both the jumping in and the hanging back approach. So this would include the flex approach, and this is basically a situation where we have the ability to both jump in and also to observe or hang back, but you might use each approach depending on what the situation says or situation dictates. And of course, when you have someone who lives or is from the culture, this is always a good thing because they can sort of be your guide. You can ask them questions, they can tell you what's going on and why it's happening and what to expect next. However, it's very good to think about the importance of using these different approaches to adapting to new situations, because the jumping in and the hanging back approach are very useful in new situations depending on what the situation is, right? However, in some situations, we may want to observe more before we do a lot of talking or communicating, right? However, in other situations, it might be expected that we just jump in and start communicating. And if you don't jump in, you might be viewed with suspicion. So it's very good to be aware of these different approaches. And as I've said in previous slides before, the fight, flight, and flex approaches are also very useful for us to consider in terms of using these in new situations we find ourselves in, even if they are not technically intercultural communication based. So a new work environment, for example, you probably want to do a lot of observing before you attempt to jump in and lead the show, right? So we can take principles from these ideas and use them in our day-to-day lives in order to be more effective communicators as well. The interpretive approach also allows us to look at the ways in which our in-depth and lived experiences shape how we immigrate or how we make sense of new places when we go there. So according to the interpretive approach, there are two theories that allow us to better understand the ways in which people make sense of a new place before they go, when they go, and how they adjust. And then the W-curve theory, which is coming up next here, and that will be the final theory we talk about on this slideshow, allows us to understand the ways in which people readjust to their authentic home environment after they have gone somewhere and returned. So according to the U-curve theory, when people are going to go to a new place, they experience anticipation. Now, new places do not necessarily have to be new countries, right? And we've talked about the fact that going to a new institution or going to a new school or starting a new job, these all qualify as a type of immigration experience, even if it's not the same level of newness, right, in terms of culture and language. But we can look at things like the anticipation or the excitement that we might feel going to a new place or a new job. We might have idealized notions of what it will be like. We might have expectations of the friends that we'll make or the people that we'll know. We might have fantasies about how good we'll be at our job and how much we're going to love our job or how much we're going to love being somewhere, right? And then you actually end up going to the place or starting the job or going to the country where you have been planning to go. And then what ends up happening? Well, you experience some culture shock, right? And culture shock is typically characterized by some discomfort. So I remember, for example, when I had gone abroad from my first any length of time when I was in my 20s, I went to Europe for several weeks. And I remember feeling the anticipation and the excitement and the sort of fantasy of what it was going to be like when I got to Italy, right? And then when I got to Italy, I remember feeling displaced. I remember thinking that I felt that I wished I had studied more Italian before I got there because I didn't really understand the language. And it was difficult to find people that spoke English. And I remember feeling like, you know, I didn't really understand some of the cultural traditions that were happening there in terms of how you did business or the ways in which people would, you know, interact and things like that. So the culture shock experience is usually one of discomfort. However, over time, once people start to interact with other people and get to know the situation, then they tend to learn what to expect, right? They tend to get a sense of uncertainty reduction. They know they have predictive uncertainty and they have explanatory uncertainty. And so they're able to adjust. They understand what's going to take place. Things become normal to them, right? You develop what's called maybe a new normal. And so this adjustment period takes time and it's not something that happens quickly. So if you ever do go to another country, or when you do start a new job or go to a new school, you can expect that the culture shock period will last for at least a couple of months, and then you will hopefully learn to adjust to that new environment, and you will start to feel more comfortable and more normal. And what ends up happening, though, is that you adjust to what is normal, and then usually at some point, if we are immigrating to a new country, or if we're going to a job for a certain amount of time, maybe you're only going to go to maybe you're going to go to a corporation in New York City for 6 months to do a project, right? So you could experience the anticipation, the culture shock, and then the adjustment phases all within that 6-month period, right? And then let's say your project is done, and now you're going to be back in the Pacific Northwest or wherever else you were, right? And then you get back, and what ends up happening is that you are actually a different person than you were when you left. And so people oftentimes tend to expect that when they get back to, let's say, a new city, or get back to the city that they came from, or let's say the country that they came from, right? They expect that things will be the same as they were when they left. And oftentimes this is not the case. And so we're going to talk about the ways in which people make sense of returning to their homeland in the W-curve theory, which is going to be the last slide in this slideshow. So according to the interpretive approach, the W-curve theory addresses the cognitive social processes that people go through when they return home after immigrating somewhere. And so we could take a situation, let's say, where a student goes abroad, okay? So the student goes abroad, and before they go, they have anticipation, they get there, they experience culture shock, and then they finally learn to adjust to the new culture because they learn to speak the language, they learn to expect what the cultural traditions are, they know what to expect, they have achieved a new normal, right? And so let's say they've done a year studying abroad in another country, and then they're going to come back to the USA. And so a lot of times people will expect that they will return home as the same person that they were when they left. They also would expect, in many cases, that the situations that they left behind would also be the same. But what we know is that in many cases, this is not the case. So, for example, let's say that you went and lived in Germany for a year, and you had figured out how to speak the language, you had some friends, you had a new normal achieved, but your year there was up, and you were getting ready to return home to the US, okay? So clearly, you would probably be faced with anticipation about returning home. So you might be excited to share all of the new culture and language things that you had learned while you were in Germany with your friends and family. You might have excitement or anticipation about being able to go back to the same group of friends that you had before you left. You might expect that your family maybe left their house the same way, right? Maybe your parents have a couple of extra rooms, and maybe they kept your bedroom the same from high school or something. And so you might expect that when you go back to see your parents, that you're going to return home to the same house, right? You may expect that when you return home, you're going to feel really comfortable again. You're going to feel like you belong, like you did before you left, right? So there's these expectations that people anticipate before returning home. And then, of course, you get back, right? You come back from, let's say, Germany, and you get back to the USA. And what you realize is, first of all, you realize you're not the same person that you were when you left. You realized that your perspective on the world has changed because you've been exposed to a different way of life and to a different set of viewpoints that you had never been exposed to before. Maybe you realize that the friends that you expected to come back to are not the same people that you left behind. Maybe they have changed, or maybe they haven't changed, but you have changed. And so the friendships and the relationships that you have with these people, you were expecting those relationships to be the same. And of course, if you change or if they change, the relationship is not going to be the same, right? So you have those kinds of shocks, right? Relational shocks, relational culture shocks. You might expect that people will be so excited to hear about your experiences. Maybe you think that they might want to hear about how everything is done in Germany, or they might want to learn some of the language from you, or they might want to hear the different perspective that the Germans have about the way that the world is being run. And maybe you might get back and you might realize that maybe people are not as open to hearing about this other perspective that you've taken on. And maybe you might feel a little disappointed about that, right? You might also expect that you're going to go back to your parents' house and you're going to see your bedroom that you left from elementary school still there with your, your awards and your trophies from karate, on the shelf, and your teddy bears and whatever else was sort of yours, right? And maybe your parents decided while you were gone to turn your old bedroom into a library, and so you don't have a bedroom to return back to anymore. So, there's all sorts of culture shocks, both emotional, psychological, and of course physical, that can shape how people experience their world when they come back from a place that they have immigrated to for a short period of time. And so, it's interesting to think about situations in our life where our expectations have been shaped by anticipation, and how our expectations have been let down, right? By the reality of the fact that we've changed, other people have changed, the world has changed. And so these are some of the types of culture shocks that people might experience when they come back from another country after going somewhere else. But then, of course, over time, what the theory suggests is that people will start to assimilate to their home culture again, and they will start to make sense of things in a way that works for them. You're probably never going to be the same person that you were before you immigrated or visited another place for an extended period of time. But at some point, people do develop a new sense of routine, a new sense of normal. Maybe the same friends that you left behind are not the same people, but you might make new friends. Or maybe you're not the same person and you don't see the world in the same way, so you might have some different interests when you get back. But over time, people learn to adjust, and people learn to make sense of their new situations so that it works for them. And so these different theories, the U-curve theory, the W-curve theory, and of course the theories of uncertainty reduction, and of course ways that we can use jumping in or observation to manage various new situations. All of these theories are very useful for us in our daily lives, and they don't necessarily have to be reserved for intercultural communication interactions. And generally speaking, I think that it's really important to remember the importance of, first of all, a kind word or a kind nonverbal gesture to somebody who is struggling, right? So helping someone out who looks like they need a helping hand. And it's also important to remember the resilience of the human spirit. And so there's been a lot of research done on the human tendencies, emotional, mental, spiritual tendencies. And what research has found is that the human spirit is amazingly resilient. And so what this means is that even if you go through a situation that is challenging or difficult, and sometimes you wonder, will my life ever get back to normal? Or, will I ever feel comfortable here? Or will I ever feel a sense of meaning in this job or in this, educational experience I'm having? Or, will I feel like I did before I left? Right? Those are very normal questions. However, it's always good to just, remind yourself that the human spirit is very resilient, and that human beings are capable of overcoming tremendous obstacles, and they're capable of adjusting and becoming well adjusted despite facing adversity of various forms. So think about that. Think about some of the challenges that you've faced, and think about some of the ways that you have been able to overcome those challenges through many of the techniques that we talked about here today. And I also encourage you to consider your own approaches to people who are the newcomers, whether they are immigrants or whether they are newcomers to your classes or to a job or to a family system. Generally speaking, and I've probably mentioned this before in this class, but I really like to emphasize, the golden rule, which is let's treat other people the way that we would want to be treated, right? And so I think that if we can just keep that principle in the forefront of our minds when communicating with people, whether these are people who are similar to us or whether they're people who are different than us, if we just think about, well, how would I like to be treated in this situation? I think that generally speaking, just, having that practice will allow us to make decisions that are both informed and emotionally and interculturally sensitive, and also that are helpful to other people who might need some help. And as we all know, if we've been in an uncomfortable, weird situation and somebody has reached out and helped us, right, and lent a helping hand to make us feel more comfortable or more included, right, those are experiences that we often remember for a very long time, if not forever. So it's just good to be aware of the fact that all of us are here on the planet, in this world, in this university, or whatever situation you're in as a student here, and we're all in this journey together, right? And what really creates meaning in life are human relationships and our ability to navigate these different human relationships with grace, poise, and dignity, right? Dignity for ourselves and dignity for other people is really something that demonstrates the magnanimous nature of the human spirit. And also, please keep in mind the resilience of the human spirit. So if you ever find yourself in a situation in the future where you feel as if you're in a culture shock and you wonder if you're ever going to be able to feel like you're okay again, just remember that there are many things that you can do to help yourself adjust, which of course includes reaching out to other people, right? Human relationships. So please keep these things in mind. And I hope you got some useful information from this lecture, and I will talk to you all in the next lecture. Thank you very much.